Where did you get that dress? Caius Brandt's voice dropped to something just above a whisper, which was somehow so much worse than a shout. And why the hell are you wearing it in front of every man in this room? 4 years. Mila Farren had spent 4 years making herself small inside the glass and steel fortress of Brandt Global Security. She wore her dark hair in a low knot, favored charcoal blazers a size too large, and kept her eyes on her spreadsheets even when the man across the mahogany table was the most terrifying presence she had ever encountered. She was a financial controller, and she was very, very good at disappearing. Caius Brandt did not deal in disappearing. He was the sole architect and undisputed head of Brandt Global, a private intelligence and security firm whose public contracts with defense ministries and Fortune 100 corporations barely scratched the surface of what the organization actually controlled. Former special operations, then a decade navigating the gray space between intelligence agencies and private capital. He was 41, broad-shouldered, and possessed a stillness that most men found unsettling and most rooms found suffocating. Senators returned his calls within the hour. 3 federal judges owed him favors they would spend their careers hoping to forget. To Caius, Mila was furniture. Exceptionally competent furniture that kept his quarterly books airtight and his offshore structures clean, but furniture nonetheless. She had made sure of it. The problem began 11 days before the Hamilton Art Trust Gala, Caius's phone call at 7 in the morning, her untouched coffee going cold. There's an event, Thursday, the Hamilton Trust auction at the Shepherd Building. You're coming. He hadn't asked. Caius Brandt never asked. The auction isn't on your calendar, Mila had said carefully. It is now. Arrange the details and wear something that doesn't look like you raided a dead man's closet. He'd paused then, the kind of pause that landed like a verdict. The account holder for the Verlaine consortium will be in the room. I need someone who can spot irregularities in real time and won't embarrass me while doing it. So it was professional. Of course it was. What Mila didn't tell him was that the name Verlaine made the blood drain from her face. She found the dress by accident. It was in the window of a small atelier on West 57th, a gown in deep garnet silk, cut on the bias, long and backless with a high halter neckline. Modest in the front, devastating everywhere else. She bought it because it was the only thing in her size that wasn't aggressively sequined, and she told herself the choice was purely practical. She knew she was lying. When the private elevator opened into Caius's penthouse suite on the 48th floor of the Brandt Tower at precisely 7:45 p.m., Mila's pulse was hammering behind her sternum in a way she hadn't permitted herself to feel in 4 years. Caius was at the floor-to-ceiling windows, facing the skyline. He had a phone pressed to his ear and a glass of dark whiskey in his left hand, and he was wearing a black tuxedo that had clearly been cut specifically for his frame. The kind of tailoring that made other men's suits look like costumes by comparison. Tell Renshaw he has until morning to move the Warsaw assets, or I'll assume incompetence and adjust accordingly. He turned. He stopped. The phone stayed at his ear, but the sentence dissolved. His eyes, dark grey, the colour of winter water, moved over her with an unhurried, deliberate focus that made Mila feel simultaneously seen and hunted. She smoothed a hand against the silk at her hip. The garnet caught the low light. "Mr. Brandt," she said, "the car is ready." He ended the call without breaking eye contact. The phone went into his jacket pocket. He crossed the room toward her with the same measured, economical movement he brought to everything, unhurried, but with a quality of total intention that made the air in the room compress. He stopped 2 feet from her. "Where did you get that dress?" His voice was dangerously quiet. "And why the hell are you wearing it in front of every man in this room?" "It's just us in the room," Mila said, and immediately regretted it. Something shifted in Caius's expression, not softening exactly. More like a tectonic thing happening beneath the surface. His eyes dropped briefly to the silk where it crossed her collarbone and fell along the line of her waist, then came back to her face with a precision that was almost clinical, except for the muscle working quietly along his jaw. "That's going to be a problem," he said. "The dress? The fact that it won't be just us." He reached past her and pressed the elevator call button. "Stay within arm's reach tonight, don't wander, and if anyone asks how you know me, you say business associate. That's what I am." Caius looked at her for a beat too long. "Not in that dress, you're not." The Shepherd Building's penthouse gallery was everything the Hamilton Trust promised in its invitation. Crystal chandeliers throwing prism light over 200-year-old oil paintings, champagne flutes moving through the crowd on silver trays, and the kind of calculated silence that belonged to people who had never needed to be loud to be dangerous. Mila had reviewed the guest manifest 3 times in the car. She knew who was laundering through which charitable shell, which intelligence contractor was front-running government bids, and which 2 men in the room were currently blackmailing a sitting cabinet secretary. She also knew Serge Verlaine would be here. She felt him before she saw him, a particular cold that had nothing to do with the gallery's climate control. Caius had kept his hand at the small of her back since they stepped out of the Escalade, and she had been acutely, humiliatingly aware of every centimeter of it. But when she caught sight of the silver-haired man in the ivory dinner jacket across the gallery, the warmth of Caius's hand vanished from her awareness entirely. Verlaine, head of a private intelligence brokerage that maintained the polished fiction of legitimacy through consulting contracts and curated board seats. The man who had come to Mila's apartment 4 years ago with a photograph of her sister, Paloma, and a proposition she hadn't been able to refuse. "You're holding your breath," Caius said quietly, very close to her ear. "The champagne's too sweet." He made a sound that might, from a different man, have been a laugh. 20 minutes later, the cold arrived. "Caius." The voice was smooth and continental, accented lightly, the kind of accent that came from decades of expensive travel rather than any single country of origin. "I wasn't expecting you to bring an escort. You usually prefer to work the room alone." Caius turned them both slowly. Verlaine stood before them with the easy confidence of a man who had never lost. His eyes moved to Mila with the recognition of someone cataloguing a known asset. And something else, something quietly triumphant. "Serge," Caius's voice contained nothing, absolutely nothing. It was the most frightening voice Mila had ever heard. "And this is your financial controller, yes?" Verlaine smiled. It didn't reach anything above his upper lip. "Miss Farren, you look entirely transformed this evening." "She's not part of any conversation you and I will be having," Caius said. "No, I suppose not." Verlaine tilted his head, still looking at Mila. "Though perhaps she should be the one to explain to you why I've had a Brandt Global insider feeding me restructured asset reports for the last 4 years. Creatively restructured, I'll give her that. The falsification was almost artful." Mila did not move. She had prepared for this moment in the abstract, the way people prepare for catastrophic weather, theoretically never expecting it to actually arrive. Caius's hand, which had been resting lightly at her back, went very still. "Her sister," Verlaine continued with the languid pleasure of a man who had rehearsed this, "has been a member of my organization since long before Miss Farren joined yours. The arrangement was simple. Access to Brandt's internal financial architecture in exchange for the elder sister's continued comfort and safety. Miss Farren has been our inside source for 4 years. He paused, though I'll admit she was considerably less cooperative than we'd hoped. The silence between the 3 of them carved the rest of the gallery away. Caius turned his head and looked at Mila. The grey of his eyes had gone the color of iron, flat, total, and utterly without temperature. It was the look she had dreaded for 4 years, the one that preceded consequences. "Is that true?" he said, not a question. "Caius." "Don't." He said it so quietly the word barely moved the air. "Don't use my name until I've asked you to. Is that true?" Mila's throat closed. Around them the room continued its gilded performance, oblivious. "Paloma came to me 4 years ago," she said. keeping her voice steady with a discipline she hadn't known she possessed until this moment. She told me Verlaine's people were going to hurt her if I didn't take the job and pass information. I took the job, but I never gave him anything real. The reports I sent him were restructured. The data was clean on the surface and corrupted underneath. I spent 4 years feeding him a very expensive fiction. Caius said nothing. If you pull the records, Mila pressed on, you'll see. The account numbers I sent him don't correspond to any active Brandt structure. The shell layers I reported have been defunct since 2021. I manufactured a paper trail designed to look like intelligence without actually being any. He's been paying his analysis team to study documents that don't lead anywhere. Verlaine's smile had developed an edge. Remarkably thorough self-defense for someone standing in a room full of people who could make her disappear. Caius moved then, not toward Verlaine but in front of Mila, not aggressively, just between them, a wall made of 5 inches of height differential and the particular quality of stillness that preceded avalanches. You came here tonight to do this in public, Caius said to Verlaine, which tells me you already know you have no leverage left. Because if you had real evidence of real espionage, you'd be in a federal building, not a gallery. You've got nothing. He leaned forward, and his voice dropped to something Mila felt in her teeth. And when I'm done tonight, you'll have considerably less than nothing. Get out of my event, Serge. Verlaine left, not quickly, but he left. Caius didn't watch him go. He turned, gripped Mila's arm just above the elbow, and moved her toward the private stairwell at the far end of the gallery without a word. His grip wasn't painful, it was absolute. The stairwell was all exposed concrete and industrial lighting. The sound of the gallery vanished behind the heavy fire door. Caius released her arm and put 6 feet between them, standing with his back to the far wall, hands loose at his side, the posture of a man exercising enormous restraint. 4 years, he said. Mila crossed her arms over the silk at her ribs. Yes. You sat across from me in every quarterly review. You handled the Baltic restructure, the Meridian accounts, the Singapore side agreement. He paused on each one, and Mila knew he was running the inventory, checking for contamination. And the whole time you were operating under duress from a competitor's intelligence broker. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? The question landed differently than she expected. Not anger, something rawer than that. Because I didn't know if you'd believe me, Mila said. And because, if you'd moved against Verlaine's people before I understood the full scope of his hold on Paloma, they would have hurt her. I needed time to understand what I was dealing with. 4 years is a long time to keep a secret inside my organization. I know. People have been removed from this organization for less. I know that too. Caius pushed off the wall. He crossed the distance between them in 4 steps and stopped close enough that she could see the faint tension in the muscles of his jaw, the way his eyes had come back to something. Not the iron flatness from the gallery, but something underneath that, something considerably more complicated. Tell me why, he said. Why protect me? You didn't owe me anything. Paloma is your family. Verlaine could have been handled quietly if you'd cooperated with him. Why spend 4 years building a false intelligence architecture to protect an employer you had every reason to resent? Mila looked at him for a long moment. She had run through versions of this answer in the privacy of her own head for 2.5 years, ever since she'd realized the feeling that came with every 7 a.m. briefing and every late-night financial model wasn't professional commitment. She had been careful. She had been relentlessly, almost violently careful about this particular truth. Because I love you, she said. I've been in love with you since the Zurich conference in year 2, when you sat in front of a Senate Intelligence Subcommittee chairman at dinner and disassembled his entire argument in 4 sentences without raising your voice, and then turned to me afterward and asked if I'd eaten because I'd been on calls all day and you'd noticed. She exhaled slowly. I love you. I couldn't hand him a single document that might have been used against you. The stairwell was profoundly quiet. Caius looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, stripped of the practiced authority, the boardroom control. Something almost uncertain, which on his face was more disorienting than anything else she had witnessed in 4 years. Then his hand came up and curved around the side of her jaw, and he kissed her in the harsh industrial light of the concrete stairwell with a thoroughness that made the rational part of her brain go entirely offline. It wasn't gentle. It was the kiss of a man acting on something he'd been refusing to name, and now that he'd named it, couldn't contain it. She gripped the lapel of his tuxedo jacket and felt 4 years of careful professional distance collapse into nothing. When he pulled back, he was breathing harder than she'd ever seen him breathe. His forehead touched hers. "I need to make a call," he said, which was not what she expected. Right now. Verlaine mentioned Paloma. If his people perceive tonight as a loss, they'll move on your sister to re-establish leverage. His hand was still at her jaw. "I'm going to have her extracted from whatever situation she's in before Verlaine's network has time to react." Mila's chest tightened. "She's in Brooklyn, the apartment on Nevin Street." "She won't be there much longer." He was already reaching for his phone, his other hand still holding her face. "When she's safe, we'll figure out the rest." His eyes found hers. "I'm not losing you over this, Mila. Understand that clearly." She nodded once. He pressed a single contact and lifted the phone. "Renshaw, code 7. Nevin Street, Brooklyn. I'll send the address. Civilian extraction, non-hostile. Bring her to the annex." A pause. "I don't care about Verlaine's response window. Move now." 3 hours later, in the fortified private annex 2 floors below the Brandt Global offices, a space that officially didn't exist on any building manifest, Mila sat watching the live feed from the extraction on a wall of monitors. Caius stood behind her. She could feel his presence without looking. Renshaw's team reached Nevin Street in under 20 minutes, 4 people in civilian clothes, nothing visible to suggest what they were. The hallway camera showed them at the apartment door. A knock, a pause. The door opened from the inside. Paloma stood in the doorway in street clothes, fully dressed, her expression not frightened. Calculating, the camera angle was good enough to catch her eyes moving over the 4-person team. Assessing, not with the panic of someone interrupted by strangers, but with the practiced reading of someone used to operational variables. Then one of Renshaw's team members said something, and Paloma stepped back, not away from the door, into the apartment toward what turned out to be a second exit. "She's running," Caius said quietly. Renshaw's team was faster. They had the second exit covered. When they brought Paloma into the annex 25 minutes later, she wasn't trembling, she wasn't crying. She walked in with her chin level, and when her eyes found Mila's, they contained something that took Mila a full, horrible moment to identify. Contempt. "Mila," Paloma's voice was even, "I assume you've made a mess of everything." "She was running a separate network," Renshaw said from the doorway, holding a tablet. He handed it to Caius. "We pulled her phone in transit. 6 encrypted channels, all routing through Verlaine's primary brokerage. She's not a peripheral contact. She's embedded." Mila stood up slowly. She looked at her sister, really looked, the way she'd been avoiding for 4 years, telling herself that Paloma was scared, that Paloma was trapped, that Paloma needed protection. She looked at the composure, the calculating eyes, the complete absence of fear. "You were never in danger," Mila said. It wasn't a question. Paloma tilted her head slightly. "You were so much easier to motivate with a story," she said. "A frightened sister, an impossible debt. You'd have done anything, and you did. You spent 4 years inside Brandt Global. We could have used you properly if you'd been willing." "But I wasn't willing." "No." Paloma's voice tightened slightly. "You were unfortunately inconvenient." Mila stood very still. The grief was there. It was tremendous, actually. A whole architecture of it she'd been unconsciously building for 4 years without knowing what she was constructing. But underneath the grief was something else. Something cold and clarifying, like the moment a fever, finally breaks. She turned to Caius. He was watching her with the grey, unreadable attention he usually reserved for negotiations with men he was about to obliterate. But there was something else in it now. He was waiting, giving her the room. "Caius," she kept her voice level, "don't have her hurt." "That decision is yours," he said, simply, completely. Something about that, the cleanness of it, the trust it implied after everything, made her spine straighten. She turned back to Paloma. "Renshaw," Mila said. The tall man in the doorway looked at her. "Every account she accesses through Verlaine's network, I need the structures mapped and frozen within 48 hours. Any information she's passed on Brandt Global in the last 4 years, I need the full scope so I can assess the actual damage and file countermeasures." She paused. "She cooperates fully, and when you're done, you put her on a one-way flight to wherever, and you don't tell me where." Paloma stared at her. "You strip everything," Mila continued. Her voice was quiet and completely absolute. "Her access, her network, her leverage. You leave her alive, but with nothing she can use." She looked at her sister for a long moment, at the stranger wearing the face she'd grown up beside. Paloma knows how to rebuild from nothing. She always has. "Mila," Paloma started. Mila turned away. The door closed. The annex was quiet after Renshaw's team moved Paloma to holding. Caius poured 2 measures of whiskey from a decanter on the side table and placed one in Mila's hand without asking. She wrapped both hands around the glass and looked at the dark surface of the liquid. "She sold you to Verlaine," Caius said, knowing what he was. "Yes." "How long have you suspected?" Mila exhaled slowly. "About a year, maybe 14 months. The details she gave me about the debt kept shifting. The timeline didn't hold. I told myself there was an explanation." She took a small sip of the whiskey. "There's always an explanation if you need one badly enough." Caius sat on the edge of the conference table, close but not crowding her. He looked at her with the same attention he'd given her in the stairwell, stripped of performance, just the actual weight of his regard. "The falsified documents you built for Verlaine," he said. "That was an extraordinary piece of work. I've had Renshaw in financial intelligence for 8 years, and he didn't catch it. I used the same shell architecture as our Cayman instruments from 2020. Identical on the surface. The account numbers were plausible but inactive. I buried the inconsistencies deep enough that you'd need a forensic accountant who already knew what to look for." She paused. "I was the forensic accountant who knew what to look for." Something moved through Caius's expression that she hadn't seen before. Not the admiration of a superior assessing competent work. Something more personal. "I read people well," he said. "That's what I'm told. It's been professionally essential." He looked at her steadily. "I didn't read you. I was very careful." "Mila." He said her name differently than he ever had in 4 years of meetings and briefings and late nights with only the city lights for company. Lower, deliberate, like something he was choosing. "I don't invite people to events because I need their professional skills. I have an entire intelligence division for that." She looked up at him. "I invited you," he continued, "because 3 weeks ago you pointed out a structural flaw in the Helsinki contract that 3 of my senior analysts had missed, and you did it in 4 words without looking up from the page, and I thought." He stopped. Started again. "I thought. I want that brain in the same room with me when I need to be watching something else. That's the most romantic thing you've said to me in 4 years. It's the most romantic thing I've said to anyone." He stood. "Give me something to work with." She laughed, a real one, slightly unsteady, the only kind available at that moment. He crossed to her in 2 steps, and this time when he kissed her it was quieter, more deliberate, with the patience of a man who had decided he was not being interrupted. When he pulled back, his hands were framing her face, his thumbs at her cheekbones. "Verlaine declared war in a gallery full of art dealers and federal contractors," he said, practical again but without releasing her. "He'll try to respond by morning. I need an hour with Renshaw." His eyes moved over her face. "And then I need to have a serious conversation with you about your title, your compensation, and your permanent position in this organization. In that order. In whatever order you prefer." His thumb traced her cheekbone once, with a care that felt entirely disproportionate to the casual gesture. "You spent 4 years protecting this company from the inside at significant personal risk, without authorization, without backup, and without ever asking for anything in return. I think that earns you considerable latitude in how we proceed." Mila looked at him, this impossibly contained, infuriatingly perceptive man who had seen right through her professional camouflage with 11 days and 1 dress, and who was currently holding her face in his hands like something he had decided to keep. "Don't close the Verlaine consortium account," she said. "I spent 2 years building a paper trail that makes it look like they owe us money. We might as well collect." Caius looked at her for a full beat. "Go sit down before I don't make that call," he said. But he was almost smiling when he said it. And that, in the end, was how Mila Farren stopped disappearing. Not with a declaration, not with a dramatic exit, just with a garnet silk dress, 4 years of quiet, invisible loyalty, and the particular relief of being seen, finally, completely, without armor, by the one person she'd spent 4 years hiding from. Caius Brandt had built an empire by knowing what things were worth. It turned out he recognized the real ones on sight.